There are people that are in leadership or that are in ministry who themselves are part of vulnerable populations.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Rev Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
And so are already walking and carrying their own trauma and their own fear while also working to support other people.
The fatal violence that ICE agents have brought to Minneapolis has stunned an already weary nation. The killing of Renee Good, a wife and a mother, sparked nationwide protests. But on the ground, the daily work of resisting ICE cruelty and abuse through community organizing continues. Faith leaders are a cornerstone of that work, and this week I'll talk to 4 religious leaders, Rev Susie Hayward, Rev Dr. Rebecca Voelkel, Rev Jim Bear Jacobs, and Rev Dr. Gia Starr Brown. We need these voices to be heard now more than ever. Make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Taking a minute to do those things really helps other people discover our show and become listeners too. Our library of past conversations includes over 150 hopeful, empowering, and inspiring interviews with guests like Selena Stewart, John Fugelsang, the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, Dr. Timothy Snyder, and many others. You can help grow The State of Belief with a financial contribution today. Find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get started, I wanted to share a clip of me speaking in front of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection headquarters in Washington, D.C. I was joined by Senators Padilla, Senator Van Hollen, Senator Chris Murphy, Representative Maxwell Frost, and many others. This was organized by Indivisible, Move On, Public Citizen, and we wanted to show up in front of the headquarters of ICE and say, ICE out for good, no more funding for ICE at the national level, and we have to rein in ICE. Many people are saying ICE, there is no reason for ICE to be in our neighborhoods at all. And so it's just, I want to share what I said coming from my perspective as a Baptist minister and as someone who is seeing the activism that is happening all across the country. Good evening. My name is Rev Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. I'm a Baptist minister. I'm the president of Interfaith Alliance, and I am one of the thousands of faith leaders across the country from every background and tradition who are showing up and speaking out against ICE's lawless operation and President Trump's abuse of power. May the memory of all those who have died be a blessing and inspire us to work for a future in which America is free from the cruelty, violence, and abuse by ICE that led to their deaths. All across America, people of faith and moral conscience are in a state of heartbreak and outrage as we see our families torn apart, communities invaded, and our neighbors abducted. We are experiencing a pastoral emergencies as unidentified masked agents terrorize our homes, our shops, our schools, and our houses of worship. These abuses are being fueled by a blasphemous co-opting of my faith by adherents of a white Christian nationalist agenda. The Department of Homeland Security has even co-opted the Bible in videos and ads to bless its cruelty with a twisted and extreme interpretation of faith that targets the most vulnerable among us, in particular, those who are not white and those who are not Christian. Let me be clear from my faith and the core of my being, ISIS's ruthless and unhinged campaign is an affront to the divine commandments to love our neighbor and to welcome the stranger. We cry out to the leadership and the foot soldiers of the Department of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Repent of the violence in your hearts. Repent of the harm of your hands and turn back towards decency, democracy, and love. We in the faith community today demand that our political leaders end these reckless immigration raids, and we oppose any bill that would add to ICE's already massive budget. Make no mistake, faith leaders and religious communities are committed and mobilized. All across the country, we the people are showing up to counter ISIS brutality with the moral power of nonviolent peaceful protest. We will counter chaos with community, confront partisanship with patriotism, and dispel dystopia by insisting on an American future free of fascism, in which we might all live together freely without hate and fear. May we live into the sacred promise that out of many, from every background, race, religion, or status, we might truly be one. May God grant us the courage to hold on to what is good, look deep within our hearts, choose love, not ice. Ice out for good. And now to our guests. Rev Susie Hayward is a minister for justice and formation at Creekside United Church of Christ in Minneapolis. She's a religion and peace scholar, activist, educator, and minister, as well as a longtime leader in faith-based organizing and justice work. Reverend Hayward also spent 14 years at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Reverend Dr. Rebecca Voelkel is Pastor for Justice Ministries and Director of the Center for Sustainable Justice and Lindale United Church of Christ, and adjunct faculty at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. She's the author of the book Carnal Knowledge of God, Embodied Love and the Movement for Justice. Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs is a Mohican pastor, author, and environmental justice leader who works with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. Formerly the Director of Racial Justice and Community Engagement for the Minnesota Council of Churches, Reverend Jim Bear weaves indigenous spirituality, Christian faith, and climate justice into powerful teachings on healing, land, and community. And Reverend Dr. Gia Starr Brown is an African-American pastor, educator, author, and activist with over 3 decades of experience advocating for underrepresented communities. With a heart for community and access for all, she stands and activates as a truth teller at the intersection of faith, education, and justice. Reverend Dr. Starr Brown is ordained in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and is the founding pastor of The Stable, an online anti-racism study church. She has authored 2 social justice curriculum books for youth and young adult leaders in ministry. All 4 of my guests have taken prominent roles in the crisis engulfing their community, bringing pastoral and prophetic voices to an incredibly volatile and dangerous situation. Reverend Hayward, I want to start with you and call upon your work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where you actually looked at how religion can be a force and a power source when confronting authoritarian efforts. And you've looked across the world at that. And now here we are in this country where we are trying to deal with our own authoritarian crisis, and especially right now in Minnesota on the streets of Minneapolis, St. Paul. I'm curious if you can give us a context into which to place this current moment in America and in Minnesota.
Thank you, Reverend Raushenbush, for having us here. It's a great opportunity for us to be able to speak to what's happening here in Minnesota to the rest of the country, because this is not just about what's happening here. This is happening to all of us. And this affects all of us. And we're getting a bit of a taste, just like our siblings in Chicago and LA and Portland and DC did, of where this administration is seeking to take us, which is to a state of authoritarianism. And we are feeling it particularly acutely here in Minnesota right now, with a kind of targeted attack that I think is actually exceptional. Even more ramped up than in some of those other cities. And I think there's reasons for that maybe we can get to later, of why Minnesota is being targeted in particular. But I was just saying to some colleagues a couple hours ago, it feels very providential to me, the hand of God, that I am here in Minnesota at this time. I grew up here, and then I spent 26 years living primarily in Boston and DC, also overseas in Nepal at a time when the Maoist insurgency was building, and in Sri Lanka in the midst of violent conflict. And I spent 14 years working with the religion program at the U.S. Institute of Peace in a lot of different countries overseas experiencing violence. And so in those years, I learned so much from religious activists of courage in those places about how to care for their communities and about how to push for justice in the midst of authoritarianism, in the midst of violence. So I feel like in this moment now, I am taking all the lessons that I learned from the Catholic sisters in Colombia, who confronted guerrilla and state-armed actors with a great deal of fierce courage and fearlessness, with their candles and their ritual and their ability to just bring the communities together and to protect their communities in the midst of violence. I'm drawing from the lessons that I learned from monks in Myanmar who were protecting Muslim communities when there were young roving mobs of young Buddhist men who were attacking Muslim businesses and Muslim communities, about how they stood in the streets, put themselves bodily in front of vulnerable communities, about how they used religious ritual in protest gatherings in incredibly powerful ways, using their alms bowls, flipping them over to show excommunication of the military leadership, various forms of metta chanting. And so I just feel like they come up alongside me now, and they taught me what to do in this moment, holding both the pastoral and the prophetic. So I'm grateful for that. Just thinking more broadly about this moment and about what's happening here, one thing that I think is really important for me to understand as an American is what's happening here is part of a larger global story. This is not particular to the U.S. There is a movement across the world to undermine international law, to undermine the democracy writ large. There's an authoritarian push that's happening across the world, and it looks very similar in different places. What's fascinating about it is the role of religion. I did a podcast series called American Unexceptionalism, where we were looking at this, but we started calling it the pluralist fascist coalition. The idea there being that you had an alignment between political actors and certain religious actors in different countries that had different religious majorities, who were coming together, aligning together across religious difference, but for their same cause of pushing authoritarianism, often driven by similar kind of economic interests and extraction, using very similar tactics. But the kind of odd bedfellows aspect of it is that, you would have, so in Brazil, Bolsonaro, or in Israel, Netanyahu, or in Turkey, Erdogan, or in India with Modi, and on and on. You have these folks aligning together across religious difference, even though they might be aligning with folks who come from a religion where in their own context, they're oppressing that religion, right? And so you have this sort of specter of Netanyahu and Trump aligning when there are quite a lot of anti-Semitic actors who are part of Trump's sort of wider world of support. And in Israel, meanwhile, you have a great deal of repression against Palestinians, which includes a significant Palestinian Christian community. And yet they're coming together across these lines of difference. And so I think my plea to fellow Americans, based on my own experience from what I've learned from those overseas, but also thinking about this as not exceptional, what's happening in America, and I use that term intentionally, is for us to say, what can we learn from others who have successfully beaten back this authoritarian breakthrough? What can we learn from the folks in Brazil who pushed against Bolsonaro's attempted coup? What can we learn from the folks in South Korea who pushed back against martial law? We have a lot to learn from other places around the world about how to protect democracy when the stakes are high. And sometimes as Americans, we're not always good at thinking about democratic lessons from elsewhere because we think we know best. But I think this moment should be giving us a huge bit of humility, a huge slice of humble pie, so we can learn from others.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I will say that if I'm finding strength, if I'm finding courage, if I'm finding hope, it is actually the innovation and the determination of people on the ground in Minnesota that are showing an incredible resolve and inspiring all of us. Reverend Dr. Gia Starr Brown, I want to turn to you. We were just talking about creativity and we were talking about responses. And I would be very interested to hear what this has inspired in you as far as how I'll say you, feel called to respond in this moment.
Thank you for that. At first, I just want to say how honored I am to be amongst such powerful and committed leaders. I'm blessed to be journeying in ministry with my 3 colleagues, which I also call family, and they know that. And so I'm really, I learned so much from them. And I think that is important. And the reason why I lift that up, one, just to give their dues, but also is to name how important it is in ministry. There tends to be the temptation to move into silo ministry where we just are doing our own thing wherever we are. And there's a duplication of services and right. And then we have the driving down of resources because we're all doing the same thing. And so being a part of a family is a wonderful illustration, I think, into to kind of opening up the dialogue about how we can do this work. Because to be honest, as we look at this, even from a 30,000-foot view, it's almost like we're playing whack-a-mole. There are just so many needs and so many places where needs are showing up and where people are asking for support and ways where just as ministry leaders, we can see the need for clergy presence. And that is the quickest way for us to get exhausted, is for us to continue to try to stay in alignment with that whack-a-mole. And so part of, I'm a mother of 5, so I have a big family as well, and being a part of a ministry family is learning how to find our lane, and recognizing that this is a marathon and not a sprint. And so looking at that creatively, for me as someone who I thrive in, looking and being a bridger and finding where the gaps are and looking to fill the gaps. For me, creatively, one of the things I look for is I look for the voices that are not being heard. I look for the gaps that are not being addressed. Just looking at, what happens, for example, in our media, we tend to center the voices of those that have the most privilege, right? Those are the ones that tend to have the loudest voice, to get invited to the microphone first. And so that means that people that tend to be most vulnerable are ones that we don't hear from routinely, which means then that the people that are at the center tend to design design the narrative and guide the narrative forward. And so as we're looking at what's happening in this moment, I started to search for the voices that are not being heard. And one of them came from, thinking about, there's two different segments. One are the stories of the people who are left behind. These are people whose, family members, whose loved ones have been detained by ICE, right, who are navigating these forces, and those that are left, the children that are left behind, the loved ones, the friends that are left behind. And typically we hear about those stories in the news, we hear about the actions in the news, but we don't hear about the stories. And so what we hear, the narratives are, oh, these are terrorists, or these are horrible people. And so in connecting and building relationships and community with folks, I'm asking to hear the full story. I want to hear about how and why they immigrated here. I want to hear about the character of your loved ones. I want to hear about the dreams and the hopes for young ones. I want to humanize people, because it's so, our nation has a tendency to move and thrive off of data. And when we just move and thrive off of data, it's so easy for us to put numbers, attach numbers to people. I was reading something that just earlier today, where people are talking about the fact that people who are being deported and detained are being moved like Amazon packages. And I thought to myself, my goodness, right? Like, there's no humanity here. But what's the best way for us to begin to really to witness and understand that these are lives that are being shifted and altered and taken and stolen, is to hear the stories and to hear about those dreams. And so I came up with a couple of other incredible colleagues. We came up with this idea for Storytelling Vigil. Is one of the creative outlets, right? Was a way for us to come together and to just hear the stories. There are people that are on the ground, that are rapid responders, that are going out to these sites where people's lives are being changed horribly, horrifically, forever, and people that are there, and we want to hear about their loved ones. We want to hear about them so that we can tell that story. Yeah. And so not only does it happen in this way where there's silence, but because of fear, people also don't have an opportunity to grieve. And we know that grieving is such an important part of ministry and of this journey, is that people need an opportunity to lament. And we need to, and sometimes people need permission to do that. So a Storytelling Vigil brings people together, both people who are wrestling with their own grief because of their loved ones whose lives have been altered, but also for people that are part of the community to be able to hear the other side of this coin, and to put names and faces and tears to these stories so that we can begin to interrupt what's happening. Another thing that I tend to focus on has been the caretakers. I mean, excuse me, that I say caretakers, some people say caregivers, those that are offering care. I think about them as well, about the stories and about the fact that it's a lot to be a wounded healer. It's a lot to be someone who carries those stories, specifically if there are people that are in leadership or that are in ministry who themselves are part of vulnerable populations, and so are already walking and carrying their own trauma and their own fear, while also working to support other people. And so part of this marathon is bringing us together as one big family, learning how to listen to each other. Think about my own children, right? And passing on a talking stick, but learning how to listen to each other, learning how to navigate differences of opinion, and learning and also discovering how to center the experiences and the stories that we are hearing. How can we carry those with us?
Up next, much more with Reverend Susie, Reverend Rebecca, Reverend Gia, and Reverend Jim Bear. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
Step into your future with an all-new series, Star Trek Starfleet Academy.
Being a cadet means being open to the people around you.
I've spent my whole life getting away from stuff, letting someone in. It's hard.
I want to be captain. I need to be captain.
Holly Hunter and Paul Giamatti's Starr.
You'll encounter challenges your predecessors never had to imagine.
Starfleet Academy. New series now streaming on Paramount Plus.
Welcome back to the State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Rev Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guests are 4 Minnesota faith leaders on the front lines of the moral battle brought to their community by the onslaught of ICE violence. Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs, I wonder if you could connect what is happening right now in Minnesota to a long history of displacement and harm, and give us a kind of a longer history of where we've been, where we are, and maybe where we might go. And a couple times ritual has come up in the conversation, and I think that I don't want to lose that thread as well, because introducing ritual is actually a way of meaning making and also creating moments of community. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. My very good friend, historian, Dr. Uhuru Williams, has coined this phrase. He says, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And we are definitely in a moment where the echoes of history are all around us. I have grown up in the Twin Cities my whole life. I'm a member of the very vibrant American Indian community here in the Twin Cities. And what I am hearing from through social media and through just being in space with people from the American Indian community is to put this in a larger context. ICE headquarters is in a building called the Whipple Building, which is named after Bishop Henry Whipple, who was the Episcopal bishop here in Minnesota in the early 1860s. The Whipple Building itself is in an area that the indigenous people, the Dakota people in Minnesota, refer to as Bedote. It is a sacred confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And for the Dakota people, this is the center of the universe. It is the place of first creation. So to use a Judeo-Christian metaphor, this is the Garden of Eden for the Dakota people. This is also the site, and the language I use when I speak of this place is this river valley holds the stories of Genesis and genocide, because this is also the site that in the winter of 1862 and 1863, following a war with the Dakota people and the U.S. government that lasted 6 weeks, 1,700 Dakota elders, women, and children were forcibly marched and placed into a concentration camp, essentially in the shadow of what is now the ICE headquarters. And so we talk about those echoes of family separation, of dislocation. And it was out of this sacred Bedote that in the spring of 1863, the Dakota people were loaded onto river barges and they were forcibly exiled out of the state of Minnesota. So the echoes of history are just everywhere here. And it's so funny to, it's not funny, it's so meaningful to be in this space now with beloved colleagues who, we have shared time in each other's living rooms and we have shared time out on the streets. And that is a beautiful thing, building that network, or as Gia said, building that family that comes together. And, back when we all kind of met each other out on the streets in Minneapolis for who knows what injustice it was at the moment, we were all using this term, intersectional or intersectionality. And I've taken it upon myself to introduce a new metaphor into the work, because intersectionality, it's so overused that it becomes absolutely meaningless. And I don't think it's a good metaphor for what we actually want to accomplish. Because if you think about intersectionality, an intersection is two people or groups coming together from their own origin, and they share space for a moment, but then they go on to their respective destinations. And the metaphor that I want to introduce to the work is confluence. And I get this right out of the language of Bedote, the sacred confluence. You think about a confluence being two people coming from their unique origins, and they share space together. And then from that moment, they share a common destination. They move together in a world towards a common goal and a common destination. And I think about all the ways that that has happened. And I'm thinking back even to, was it 2014 when Jamar Clark was killed by a Minneapolis police officer in North Minneapolis. And we had this occupation of the police precinct in North Minneapolis, the 4th precinct, which was, there's no way around it. That was a Black space. Jamar Clark was a Black man. It was an injustice to Jamar Clark. It was an injustice for the Black community in North Minneapolis. And there's no doubt about it. It was a Black space. It was where Black voices could be raised in frustration and anger, but also hope and love. But every night of that, and I don't remember how long the occupation lasted, but every night of that occupation, if you went and visited, you would hear the sacred drums from the Native community. You could smell the smoke from our medicines being lifted up. You could hear the prayers. That was true the 4th precinct. That has been true in George Floyd Square. And that is true now with the unrest and response to the killing of Renee Good here in Minneapolis. You will see, like, I was just at, like, I literally just came from 34th and Portland where Renee was killed. Just kind of looking at the growing memorial that's there, and you can see the Indigenous presence that has been there. You can see that. And that I think is what is so beautiful. And, there isn't a frightening, for me as a Native person, this is a frightening moment. Paul, for 30 years, I have carried around in my wallet my tribal ID, which is just a proof of tribal citizenship. And I, when all, even before this latest ICE invasion, I thought that tribal ID kind of gave me a free pass to be free from harassment of ICE. Like, I can pull it out of my wallet and it says beyond a shadow of a doubt that I have more right to be here on this land than anyone else. And we know now that that's not true. I, as well as any Native that's in Minneapolis or St. Paul right now, if we have passports, we are being encouraged to carry our passports with us at all times, because we know that our tribal IDs are not sufficient, because we've seen, it was a number of hours after Renee was killed, ICE picked up and detained 4 citizens of the Oglala Nation out of South Dakota. A man from Red Lake, which is a northern Minnesota tribe, a man from Red Lake was pulled out of his car and harassed. And so it's not like make no mistake, this is not about undocumented people being here. This is about people with brown skin, the so-called undesirables who, and this is just colonization 101. We move in, we establish the desirables and the undesirables, and we do everything we can to legally justify the removal of the undesirables. And right now, the undesirables are anyone with brown skin.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Reverend Dr. Rebecca Voelkel, you are both a scholar and a pastor, and this, frankly, everyone on this call is coming from some kind of faith background, faith inspiration that is, putting them in places of asking questions and showing up and being present. What role does faith play in this moment of showing up against what ICE is doing to your community?
Thank you so much for the question. And I just want to echo my deep honor and gratitude for being in this circle with my three beloved colleagues. And Paul, for your leadership, honored to be in space with everybody. I feel like I want to lift up this strong contrast. On the one hand, particularly as a Christian, the fact that so much of this ICE surge is done in the name of a diseased and distorted Christianity, particularly a diseased and distorted white Christianity. That is, as Bishop Joseph Tolton from the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries has said, that Project 2025, that the New Apostolic Reformation, the Seven Mountain Mandate moment that we are in is simply a modern rearticulation of the doctrine of discovery. And that the diseased and distorted center of that is that there are some who are human, namely white and Christian, and the rest are not human, subhuman, a sort of deep sin of superiority and supremacy. And so I feel like we're experiencing this kind of upsurge of that kind of diseased and distorted Christianity. And in response, the depth of genuine multi-faith, the best part of our spiritual traditions are on display here in Minneapolis. I was just on a call with a Somali Muslim imam who talked about the aunties who are making thousands and thousands of sambusas to come to feed the mourners, and the ways in which there is this understanding that Renee Good died for the Somali community. And I was witness to the sambusas being passed out in a kind of communion with Jewish and Christian and other clergy. The fact that there are multi-faith clergy people literally putting their bodies between ICE officers and targeted communities, and with colleagues trying to be at the Whipple building that Jim Bear has so beautifully described, and the history of that, and witnessing to how do we witness to the sacred part of the Christian tradition, which is at its core love of God and love of neighbor, and this the ways in which we are called from our religious traditions to work together to show up for the people in grief, as Gia has so beautifully spoken of. And I feel this sort of deep responsibility as a Christian pastor to respond to this moment in a different way. And also this deep grounding in this multi-faith community, which unfortunately here in Minneapolis has quite a long history, as Jim Bear pointed to the police murder of Jamar Clark, of Philando Castile, of George Floyd, and the ways in which an acolyte of the New Apostolic Reformation assassinated Speaker Emerita Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark. There is this, we unfortunately have a long history of working in a multi-faith way to stand against white Christian nationalism and state violence, and stand together in support of this multiracial, multi-faith, multi-class democracy that is alive and well here in Minnesota. And so I feel both compelled, convicted, and deeply honored to be amongst y'all.
I love that so much. And we had Najiba Saeed on this program just a few weeks ago, who was right after the president was just making just these violent rhetoric against the Somali community that continues. And she recently wrote a piece that I think was extremely moving about just lived neighborly faith. And I think there's something very powerful about the idea of, what does it truly mean to love your neighbor in a moment when your neighbor is under attack? And I'd love for each of you to just take a minute and we're trying to lift up courage as a principle, as something that we can each listener can hold and hopefully be inspired to show up in the way that they can show up. I'd like to ask each of you what courage means to you in this moment, especially in the context of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Twin Cities, where each of you is showing courage and you're also witnessing courage. What does courage mean to you? Can I start with you, Reverend Susie?
We had a children's sermon a couple weeks ago where my colleague said to the kids, bravery doesn't mean not being afraid. Bravery means being afraid and still moving forward. And that is what courage feels like right now. This is a very scary time in Minneapolis. I'm not going to mince words. It feels like we are under siege, like the federal government declared war on us. And we're seeing awful things in our streets to our neighbors. And the courage is demonstrated every day in the fact that people are holding that fear and that grief, and yet they're still going out on the streets. And it's that deep connection with each other and their conviction, whether they're Christian or not, love God. And I understand God sometimes is also synonymous with love. Love neighbor, the greatest command of all, that people are so grounded in that here as they move forward into the streets to support one another.
Reverend Dr. Chia?
Sometimes courage, I'm not a person that minces words. Sometimes courage is getting up out of the bed in the mornings. Sometimes courage is, right? Sometimes courage is literally stepping outside of your door and having a conversation with your next door neighbor. I grew up in a time when everybody knew everybody else, right, in community, and now we haven't done that so well, right? We don't know who is in our community. So courage isn't always big in front lines and on the news. Courage can be checking on that family that lives across the street. It can be literally opening up on a personal level, opening up, if you're a Christian, your Bible, or if you are, another faith, the sacred text, and looking at, and really looking at what does your sacred text say, right, about how to show up in these moments. Courage doesn't have to be big and public. It can be personal and small and taking the step. It can be, deciding to subscribe to a news site or a news station that is speaking of voices. Here I'm again about voices, right? Voices that you may not typically be hearing from, to hear those stories and to share those stories at your dinner tables, and in your congregational spaces. I think that all of this takes courage because let's just be honest, even with all of us doing front-facing things, there are times when neither one of us want to get out of the bed in the morning. I'm just going to speak for all four of us, right? Like there are times when we don't want to get out of bed, and there are times when we don't want to turn on the news and we don't want to face the day. And it takes courage to do those things. And so, and we're all invited into that, right? Regardless of our situations, our own individual or societal circumstances, we all can take even these tiny steps of courage as well.
Thank you for that. That is such a good reminder. And in that, I hear also, there's a certain maybe courage in just listening to your own body and listening to like what you need and respecting that for that day and saying it's okay for me to do what I need to do for me today so that I can get up tomorrow. I just really appreciate that intervention. Reverend Jim Bear, what does courage feel like or look like to you?
Paul, I think about the role of the prophet, which is a keystone to so many faith traditions around the world. And we know that pretty universally, the voice of the prophet, A, is never appreciated in the moment that it's needed, and B, comes at an incredible personal cost to the prophet. And all of us know that cost. All of us on this call have been a prophetic voice, yelling into the hurricane that faces us. And it gets our names in the papers that we may not always welcome, gets, us on TV, which we may not always welcome. But I think courage for me is speaking out, even though you know that it will cost you something. And the beautiful thing that I think we are seeing in this moment, and in particular in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and this kind of goes to what Dr. Gia was saying. There is such a beautiful network of activists and organizers here that I know that I don't have to show up and fight 100% every single day. Because this network, this family that Gia mentioned, I know that when I want to spend the entire morning in bed with the covers over my head, I know that Susie and Rebecca and Gia will continue to be that prophetic voice in my absence. And likewise, they know that as well. We are a strong group of just people with beautiful hearts who know that what we are experiencing right now is not only wrong, but it's morally evil. In whatever tradition comes from, it is morally evil. And I know that when I find that strength and that courage to put my body on the front line, like I have, like all of us have, I know that I'm not going to be the only one. And that's an incredibly beautiful feeling to carry with you. Because I think all of us, who receive that label as activists, I think all of us can think back to a time not that many decades ago when it felt like we were the only ones. And we know how lonely that can feel. And maybe that's what courage is. It's the conviction that no one's going to feel lonely in this struggle and in this fight.
Wow. Thank you. Reverend Dr. Rebecca.
When I was in high school, the Civil War in El Salvador was raging, and I was part of the accompaniment movement. And when I was leaving to go, so many of my white colleagues were saying to me, "Be safe, be safe." And one of my Salvadoran mentors and colleagues said, "I'm not going to tell you to be safe because that's a fallacy. What my prayer for you is to go with God." And so I feel like courage in this moment is knowing that you take each step going with God. And I just would echo what others have said, that whatever actions that we are taking, none of, like, literally going with a buddy, the sacredness of going together, is the other piece about what gives me courage in this moment.
I just want to name, like, the beauty of this conversation is really that shines through so profoundly for me is the community. And I think that is, there's a sense, and, goes back to the stories that we tell, but there's a sense of trauma, which is real, of crisis, which is real, of occupation, which is real. And what I think is also real is a sense of community, of support, of people showing up, of love, of real deep spiritual commitment to a world that in some ways you four and the many others that surround you are not waiting for, but actually living into right now in the way you respond to this moment. And I just think that's, like, for you, our listeners, I hope you heard that. Because I had the benefit of watching the faces this entire conversation, and just the real love, the real smiles, the real sense of community. And I think that for those of you who are living in cities, maybe where this has already happened, or maybe where you're anticipating it will happen, in some ways, how will we all build community? I'm living in New York City, and we're trying to do that right now. There is a history of working together, but also there are still so many ways we need to build community to meet the moment that we anticipate will come, and is already here in many ways, frankly. ICE is already very present. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Gia Starr Brown. I want to thank Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Rebecca Voelkel. I want to thank Reverend Susie Hayward, each of you. And I want to thank you collectively for this incredible conversation, a very special insight into the life and the spirit of Minnesota and what is happening on the ground there. So thank you all very much for joining us today on The State of Belief.
Thank you, Paul. We really appreciate the opportunity to testify to the gorgeous, gorgeous, diverse, vibrant, loving city.
Who do you know who would get a lot out of this discussion? Please share The State of Belief with them, and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to keep growing The State of Belief, so please make a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.